Sorry, Carol. I had to do that, Carol. I'm sorry.
You're not sorry at all.
Thank you for coming. Hope you enjoyed last week as much as I did. Good. Bernie Miller. Very good. Lars, do you have any visitors?
We do have some visitors that are staying with us, but they're running late. It was a former student from Far Eastern Academy that lived in our dorm. And he was late a lot there too. It changed in the last 50 years.
Yeah.
No, he had a bad accident in '89 and lost an arm, and it's had an adverse effect. His wife, his present wife, was Tonda Iverson. If anybody is from Berrien Springs might know her. Anyway, they're with us and with his son. But John's out there to meet them.
Okay, great. You say Iverson?
Iverson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I knew something.
Okay. Anyway, it's our wait. Okay, tell us about yourself. He is. Well, that doesn't matter. As we are old and we don't always remember. Wampler's, the daughter is. They're doing music today, and this is the father.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, there you go. We're glad you're here.
I came here one time before COVID, and then it shut down.
Thank you. Oh.
Got in the habit of not coming.
Oh, okay, okay. Well, it's a good place to be.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. Oh, yes. Go ahead. Yeah.
What?
Well, Larry's back. We haven't seen him.
Oh, Larry. Well, he's not a visitor, and I don't want to make him feel set apart.
Go ahead.
We haven't seen him in a while,
Yeah.
and it's nice to have him here. Jeff is here, Connie Hammond, and we haven't seen him in a while in our class. He's been coming to church though, so you don't need to put him on a special list.
You have to put him on the backslider list.
We're so glad Larry's here today. Absolutely. Hi, Mary Ellen.
I've got to go greet now. So I'm not leaving because I don't want to be here.
Phew.
Don't worry. Thank you for coming. Oh, well, anyway. Okay, well, come on in. Does anybody need, I always forget, anybody need a harmony?
I just gave one to him. Good morning. These people are back. They've been gone for a while, haven't you? Come on in.
And welcome to our Zoom folks. And Doug, you have one more week until graduation, is that right? Yeah. We graduated here a month ago. Something like that. Yeah. Before we get started, Roy has an announcement.
Yeah, what I wanted to do is, I guess about a month and a half ago, I came in with a paper that I introduced, and a lot of you picked it up. And I wanted you to know that this one here is a letter to the 144,000. We're going to start teaching this, not this coming week, but the next week. And what this is looking at the sequencing of the end time events through Revelation. And so you're welcome to pick up one of these if you would like to. Good. And if you decide that you would like to learn more about what it's talking about, then you can come to the class at 11:30 is when we have it up in the conference room. Thank you very much.
So you're not competing with this class then?
No, no.
Wow.
And with that, good to see Duane here again. He had a very tough time there for a while. Good to have you. And with that said, Duane, why don't you have our prayer?
Our loving Father, thank you for this beautiful Sabbath day and the privilege that we have of coming together and worshiping you. We pray that our minds and hearts will be open to receive your word. We ask in your name. Amen.
Doug will now pick it up from where Bernie Miller left off last week. We're ready to go.
Good to see all of you. And even though I was not with you live, or I should say online live last week, I did listen to the Sabbath school from Bernie Miller a day or so later, and just really was blessed. So I'm grateful, Ken, that you invited him to come, and I do hope that he can come back again. And it is good to be with you. It seems like it's been a while. And we are in a passage today that is very familiar. It's the Good Shepherd passage. And it's one of those passages of scripture that suffers from familiarity. We hear it so often, we know phrases from it, we probably memorize some phrases from it. And so we feel like, okay, we know that. What can we find in it that is new or interesting or helpful? I hope that we'll find that today. It's actually, like so many other passages that we study, so full, so rich, that we will not cover even a fraction of it. But the hope is that we will cover something that will be worthwhile. And here's the direction we're going with this passage today on the Good Shepherd, is to see who Jesus is and why it matters. Who Jesus is and why it matters. And of course, in the moment when this story actually happened, that question was a burning question for everybody present. This story still takes place during the Feast of Tabernacles, which is in the fall, just before the cross in the spring. So we're about 6 months out from the cross. And much of what we are going to be studying for the next number of lessons takes place in this last 6 months period before the cross. And right now we're in Jerusalem, and starting with Ken's lesson on the 72 next week, we're going to go outside of Jerusalem. We're actually going to go a ways outside, crossing the Jordan and going over to Perea and that area on the eastern side of Jordan. And many of the stories that we're going to have over the next few weeks following this are going to be taking us away from the heat of what's going on in Jerusalem. And then we're going to come back to it a few months later at Hanukkah, which is at Christmas time in the winter, and we're going to see another death threat on Jesus' life. And this death threat is going to take place in the winter, just before the spring of Jesus' death. And so we see that the temperature is going to keep rising toward the cross. Well, right now, what we're dealing with is this same few days surrounding the Feast of Tabernacles. We'll come back to that context a little bit later, but right now I want to jump right into the passage and look at this famous passage. We'll read it through, and then we'll begin asking some questions about this shepherd bit, because Jesus is picturing himself as a shepherd, which is a little bit odd for us. Most of us are not familiar with shepherds. If we have even seen sheep, usually they're just out in the field kind of doing their own thing. And if we've seen large sheep operations, it's handled a little bit more like cattle. And so this whole idea of a shepherd and a relationship between some shepherd and a bunch of sheep is really a little bit unfamiliar to us from a day-to-day standpoint. Probably our greatest familiarity with it is in religious paintings, where we see Jesus walking along with a lamb in his arm and, you know, a staff with a crook on it in his hand. And we see that in stained glass windows, and we see it in religious art. But again, we don't have a lot of picture. Remember that for the people that Jesus was speaking to, this was a really common activity. They saw this a lot. And Jesus was speaking about something that was really familiar to them. If you remember, at Jesus' birth, it was shepherds who were first on the scene to show up and welcome him. There were shepherds around. In fact, Bethlehem, where Jesus was born, had a lot of sheep raised there and a lot of shepherds. Part of that was to feed the industry of the sacrificial offerings in Jerusalem, just 7 miles north of Bethlehem. So they were really familiar with shepherds. Jesus was not talking about something that was strange and unfamiliar to them. He was talking about something that was really quite common. In fact, it's very likely that there were some shepherds listening as he talked to them. This was something they were familiar with. Shepherds had a reputation in Jesus' day that was a little bit different than the reputation they had throughout history. And we've got to separate those two out. In the time of Jesus, shepherds were considered to be about as low down as you could get on the social status. The actual occupation of being shepherds was considered to be fairly low. And so when the shepherds came to see Jesus, as Luke records it in Luke chapter 2, this was the equivalent of people who work for minimum wage at a fast food restaurant, and they come in their dirty, greasy aprons, and they are, just off night shift, and they come to see this baby born. It's kind of that. They were at the low level of social status. Now, the interesting thing is that throughout the history of the people of Israel, shepherds had oftentimes been equated with kings. And we're going to look at that in just a minute. And so you have this interesting paradox that in the current day, shepherds were kind of low life. Like I said, they were kind of the minimum wage employees who would come from Burger King or Taco Bell or McDonald's after a long shift, smelling like, French fries and having grease all over their aprons. And nobody would consider them really high status sort of people. These are people that are either working a minimum wage because they can't get a better job, or their kids working their way through school. That was kind of the status of shepherds in Jesus' day. And yet on the other hand, they had this rich tradition that David was a shepherd king, and that God himself called himself their shepherd. And they had the famous psalm that we've memorized, "The Lord is my shepherd." And so you have these two very interesting opposing ideas that in current culture, current reality, shepherds were kind of the low life, and yet shepherds also had this very exalted position in their history. And I don't think that's all totally accidental. Because as we look at the contradictions in the life of Jesus, we see that same sort of contradiction. That on the one hand, he is the king of the universe. He is the Messiah. He has come to live among us as the real king of Israel. And so he has that exalted picture from the past. And at the same time, he was a very common working class man from a lower class profession. He was not one of the aristocracy, and he was often treated with contempt because people would say, "Who are you?" And Jesus embodied in himself this very contradiction that even the word shepherd embodied for the average person in that day. On the one hand, he had this exalted picture of being a king, and on the other hand, he was a very common, ordinary peasant. And people had a hard time putting that together. So that's something to keep in mind too with this idea of shepherd. Now, I want to know if I got, nope. I'm always aware when my phone dings that one of you has texted me a question, because sometimes those of you listening online or even in class will text a question. But this happens to be our family Wordle report. Anybody does Wordle? Nobody? Nobody here? Oh, there's one who will admit it. Okay. Well, we have a group of us who do Wordle. It's a fun word game online, and we send our results to each other every day. And that was just the report of who was doing Wordle. So not a question from class. I'm getting a bunch of blank stares from you. Sorry, we'll leave that topic and go back to shepherds. Okay, so what I'd like to do is read this passage, keep that in mind, and then we'll go back and we'll look at this bigger question: who is Jesus? And what does it matter? So we're starting here in John chapter 10. And if you have your harmonies, it's on page 118. Page 118. And you'll notice that this is in the middle of the story that Bernie Miller so beautifully opened for us last week, because it is the continuation of that story. The chapter divisions are artificial. Those were added centuries later. And so the division between chapter 9 and chapter 10 is very artificial. We move from one chapter into the next with no break in the story. And so you'll need to look carefully to find this. As you look down about 3/4 of the way down the page, you'll find John chapter 10, verse 1, starting there right after verse 41 of John 9. Everybody found it? John chapter 10, verse 1. Jesus says, I tell you the truth, the man who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The man who enters by the gate is the shepherd of his sheep. The watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but they did not understand what he was telling them. Therefore, Jesus said again, I tell you the truth. I am the gate for the sheep. All who ever came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. He will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks and the flock is scattered. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own account. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. At these words, the Jews were divided. Many of them said, he is demon possessed and raving mad. Why listen to him? But others said, these are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? And with that last reference, you see that we're tied back into this larger story of the healing of the blind man. I mean, this is right on the heels of that. So we'll come back to that context later. But right now, let's just think about this shepherd, and then we'll dig into the details of this in a moment. Having acknowledged that shepherds are not something in our daily lives, and just from what you know of Jesus as the good shepherd and kind of what you've learned over the years, if Jesus were here today, can you think of some occupation that he might have chosen to compare himself to? Some way that he might have tried to explain who he is using a metaphor that made sense to us instead of shepherd. Shepherd kind of made sense to them. They were familiar with that. What occupation or what sort of metaphor would he use about himself if he was here today talking to us? Does anything come to your mind?
Head football coach.
A football coach. Okay. Thank you. Somebody else.
Teacher.
I am the good football coach. That would make a nice stained glass window, wouldn't it?
Teacher.
I'm the teacher. Okay. Somebody else. Certainly, we haven't exhausted your creative imagination.
I'm a landscaper.
I'm the landscaper. Okay. Anybody else? Somebody online, maybe. Unmute and pop in here. Anybody else? You guys remember the story of the cross and the switchblade that was later made into a movie? starring Pat Boone as the lead character. Anybody remember that? That's an old story. I just recently reread it. It's a story of a pastor who has no experience in the inner city and with gangs back in the 60s. And he feels God calling him to New York. And he begins working with some of the roughest gangs in New York there in the 1960s. Interesting book if you haven't read it. It's actually available free online. Now it's kind of in public domain. But in there, I'm pretty sure it was in there, that one of these gang members who was coming to Christ was trying to understand the gospel and who Jesus is. And one of his ways of understanding Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, was in his mind translated this way because he'd had a very good experience with a particular person who had been there for him, good and bad, thick and thin. And the way that he read this converted gang member who was trying to mature in Christ, he read, the Lord is my truant officer. Now, I'm not sure that would be true for every truant officer, but apparently he had a truant officer who was like a good shepherd to him. Well, let's stick with the metaphor of good shepherd, because Jesus was talking to people who understood this. And he was talking to people who had a rich history in Scripture. And so I'm going to ask you to do something that we do from time to time. I'm going to ask you to pull out your Bibles that include the Old Testament, because we're going to take a quick survey through the Old Testament. If you don't have your hard copy of your Scripture, I'm sure you can find it on the phone. And we're going to go clear back to the book of Genesis. And we're going to see that from almost day one, this image of a good shepherd was being built layer by layer by layer. And when Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, it is not coming out of thin air. It is coming out of this rich, rich history of God interacting with his people as being a shepherd. So let's start with Genesis. Go back to Genesis chapter 4. So pretty early here. Genesis chapter 4. And we see here in verse 2, Eve gave birth to Abel, and Abel became a keeper of flocks. He was a shepherd, and Cain worked the soil. So these first two brothers, Cain is a farmer, and Abel is a shepherd. Now, we don't get a lot of detail there, but we see that from very early on, this relationship between a shepherd and his sheep is pictured, interestingly enough, as one of the very first relationships between people and their work, people and animals. And it happens to be that the good guy, Abel, the one who is in love with God and gets killed for it, is the shepherd. That's just a little indication, but turn a little bit farther. Go to Genesis chapter 31. Just turn a page over, a few pages over. Genesis chapter 31. And another early Bible character, Jacob. And Jacob, of course, is the one whose name will be changed to Israel. And so this is kind of the starting of all this children of Israel. He has 12 sons who become the 12 tribes. And so we're pretty early on here in the story. And Jacob, as you remember, worked for his father-in-law Laban as what?
Genesis chapter.
Shepherd.
Chapter 31, Genesis 31. What was Jacob's work for Laban?
As a shepherd.
As a shepherd, yeah. And at one point, he's in a bit of an argument with his father-in-law. And his father-in-law, you might remember, was always trying to cheat him. And here in Genesis 31 and verse 38, Jacob says, I have been with you for 20 years now. Your sheep and goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten rams from your flocks. I did not bring you animals torn by wild beasts. I bore the loss myself. Now, again, there's a case being built here for a good shepherd. This is a shepherd who is watching out for the animals and also watching out for the good of the whole. And in this case, it's Laban. He said, hey, Laban, I took the loss myself. I didn't pass the loss on to you. It goes on. I did not bring you animals torn by wild beasts. I bore the loss myself, and you demanded payment from me for whatever was stolen by day or night. This was my situation. The heat consumed me in the daytime, and the cold at night, and sleep fled from my eyes. It was like this for 20 years I was in your household. Now, the story, we've studied this when we studied the book of Genesis. It's an interesting one. But for now, I just want you to see that some of the earliest people that were in the line of the children of Israel were shepherds who could be called good shepherds. And in this, you get the idea that being a shepherd was not just all nice green pastures and photo ops with, fuzzy lambs in your arms. He says, I lost a lot of sleep over these flocks. And it was cold sometimes, and it was wet and dark and damp. And he said, it wasn't always fun. And I mean, it's a very unromantic picture of being a shepherd. And most of the stained glass windows that we have are pretty romantic pictures. It's just really this beautiful green pasture, and Jesus' hair is perfectly combed, and he's holding a nice fuzzy lamb in his arm. And that's not the picture you get from this good shepherd, Jacob. It was some hard, dirty, sweaty, cold work. And he said, that's what it was like being a shepherd. And for 20 years, I did that for you, Laban, and you didn't even pay me well. You didn't appreciate it. I was doing it for other reasons. So that's the context, but it gives you a picture of a good shepherd early on. Now, turn a little bit farther. Go to Genesis chapter 48. On his deathbed, Jacob is now an old man and he's dying.
Yes.
And notice what he says here in Genesis 48, as he is blessing his son Joseph. Genesis 48, verse 15. Then he blessed Joseph and said, may the God before whom my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he bless these boys. And he's, of course, talking about Joseph's two boys. May they be called by my name and the names of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and may they increase greatly upon the earth. But don't miss the shepherd reference. May the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day. Now remember what kind of a shepherd Jacob had been. Jacob said, I bore the loss myself. When it was cold, I was out there with the sheep. When it was hot, I was out there with the sheep. When wild animals were after them, I was out there with the sheep. How much richer it is to understand that Jacob, who knew what it was like through good and bad, through the tough times, what it was like to be a good shepherd, could say, God has been my shepherd all my life. Isn't that a great picture? He says, God has been with me there when it's been cold, when it's been hot, when the wild animals have been after me. He's been there. He's been in my corner. God has been my shepherd all my life. So this picture of a good shepherd begins to build. Now, turn a little bit farther forward. Look at the book of Exodus, chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2 and verse 11. Here we find another one of the greats of history. One day, Exodus chapter 2, verse 11. One day, after Moses had grown up, oops, I'm not in the right place. Just look down to chapter 3, verse 1. Sorry, chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now this is, of course, where he sees the burning bush and God calls him to do a much bigger shepherding job. Instead of shepherding a bunch of sheep, he's to shepherd a couple of million stubborn people. And this is his change from one type of shepherding to another. But it's again a picture of a good shepherd. Moses was a good shepherd, not always appreciated. And much like Jacob with his father-in-law, Moses with his father-in-law was taking care of his sheep. And I imagine he could have said much the same thing, although I think he got along with his father-in-law better than Jacob did with his father-in-law. But he said, hey, I've been out there in the cold. I've been out there in the heat. I've been out there with the wild animals. I have been a good shepherd for these flocks. And Moses. So we have Jacob, we have Moses, we're going to see David. But this idea of a good shepherd builds, there's a rich history of it through the stories that these people knew, through the history that was a part of their very being. Turn forward a little bit farther forward. Go to the book of 1 Samuel chapter 16. 1 Samuel chapter 16. We've read this when we studied the life of David. 1 Samuel 16. You remember when Samuel was looking to anoint a new king, he comes to the house of Jesse, and Jesse brings all of his sons before Samuel, and each one, God says, no, not that one, no, not that one, not that one either. And finally, Samuel says, look at verse 11. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons you have? Yeah, they're still the youngest, Jesse answered, but he's tending the flock. He's tending the sheep. Now we begin to get the first inkling that taking care of sheep wasn't necessarily this high and mighty exalted position that would result in being the good shepherd and ending up in stained glass windows. This was the job of the youngest. This was the leftover job. This was not the important job. This was the job that you got if everybody kind of forgot about you. You were the shepherd. Now it's going to have a revival through the kingship of David, but you begin to get this tension here of shepherding being a lower status job. And this is where this tension comes of it being not only a lower status job, but a job for kings. And that's where the tension comes in the life of Jesus. But here we see, you have another son? Yeah, we do. He's the youngest and he's out tending the sheep. Samuel said, send for him and will not sit down until he arrives. And so he sent and had him brought. He was ruddy and of fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, rise and anoint. He is the one. And we begin to see now something that develops in this story of David as the shepherd that just ramps this thing up to a whole nother level. It gets turbocharged here because from this point on, the idea of being a shepherd and a good shepherd takes on newer, fuller, richer meanings than it's ever had. It's been growing and now it just gets supercharged. Turn to 2 Samuel chapter 5. 2 Samuel chapter 5. David was chased around by Saul for many years. And finally after, Gordon, you have a comment, please.
Well, it just struck me that if you look at the shepherds at Jesus's birth, you look at the shepherds, Moses' role in shepherds, and now David. It seems to me like that role was more than just a mirror of Christ, because Christ was the shepherd in the sense of helping, being there for you. But it was also something that matured them.
Yep. Excellent point. Jacob and Moses especially grew up by being shepherds. They matured. They got rid of some of the really junky stuff in their characters by being shepherds. Excellent point, Gordon. Thank you. Okay, let's move fairly quickly here. I've got just a few more I want you to see, but there's a progression that really picks up here. So we have 2 Samuel chapter 5. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, we are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler. In the mouths of the people who are embracing David as their king, they begin to get it. And what you said, Gordon, fits in here, and that is they begin to realize that this metaphor of being a shepherd is a metaphor of a person who is growing into maturity to be able to care well, not so much for animals, yes, that too, but for people. And they say, we want you to take care of us. We want you to be our shepherd. We want you to be our king. They're acknowledging something. that they don't even have any idea how big this thing is going to get. And it's going to get big. So keep going. I want you to turn to now Psalm 23. Of course, this is the familiar passage. This sounds a lot like Jacob in chapter 48 of Genesis on his deathbed. And here David says in Psalm 23, verse 1, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Could I suggest that this is the flip side of what Jacob said? From the sheep's perspective, hey, this is great. I've got a shepherd. He takes care of me. What's it like from the shepherd's perspective? Yeah, it was cold. It was hot. It was lonely. I lost sleep. That's how the shepherd experiences it. How does the sheep experience it? I've got a shepherd. He's taken it for me. And just be aware that what is to our benefit costs the shepherd something. And that's not a bad thing to keep in mind when we say Jesus is my shepherd. Don't forget that cost him something. That cost him his sleep. It cost him his comfort. And so when we read Psalm 23, we may find a lot of comfort in it. Don't forget that our comfort cost Jesus something, kind of like what Jacob said to Laban. Hey, I took care of your sheep, but it cost me something. Now, go a little bit farther forward. Look at another psalm here. Psalm 28 and verse 9. The psalmist David cries out, save your people and bless your inheritance. Be their shepherd and carry them forever. Turn to Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 11. Isaiah 40, verse 11. He tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those that have young. Probably one of my favorite shepherd passages, because it pictures so clearly what Jesus does for us when he is our shepherd. He holds us close to his heart. He cares for those that are weak and vulnerable. Now, this takes a sudden turn, because what happens next is that in the remainder of the Old Testament, there's a great conflict, because God says, I have been modeling for you ever since the time of Cain and Abel and Jacob and Moses and David, what it means to be a good shepherd. And now when I've asked for you to join me in this shepherding work, you've done something very different. You've exploited the very people that I asked you to help care for. Turn to the book of Zechariah, near the Old Testament. Near the end of the Old Testament, just before the book of Malachi, just a few pages. Go to Matthew and then go back a few pages and you'll find Zechariah. And here in Zechariah chapter 11 and verse 15, Zechariah 11:15. Then the Lord said to me, take again the equipment of a foolish shepherd. Now this is a very different shepherd than the good shepherd. These are fools. And drop on down to verse 17. Woe to the worthless shepherd. These shepherds are fools. They're worthless. He says, woe to the worthless shepherd who deserts the flock. May the sword strike his arm and his right eye. May his arm be completely withered, his right eye totally blinded. And so there's a whole different type of shepherd pictured here. And these type of shepherds come in for a fair amount of rebuke in the remainder of the Old Testament. These are the leaders of the people that instead of caring for the flock are exploiting the flock. And probably the richest passage, and it's the last one we're going to look at in the Old Testament, is Ezekiel. Go back a few pages to the book of Ezekiel. chapter 34, Ezekiel 34. And with this, we're going to read a little bit more than we've read in some of the other Old Testament passages. And then we're going to jump directly back into John 10. Because if I'm not mistaken, Ezekiel 34 is exactly the backdrop for John 9 and 10. It's exactly what Jesus had in mind. And I think you'll see why when we read it. It'll make more sense to you now that we have looked at a quick survey of shepherds in the Old Testament. Look at Ezekiel chapter 34, starting with verse 1. Ezekiel 34, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. These are the foolish, worthless shepherds. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says to you. Woe to the shepherds of Israel who only take care of themselves. Now contrast that with Jacob, the good shepherd, who said, I was cold, I was hot, I was out there in the elements fighting off the wild animals. I wasn't worried about myself. I was taking the loss myself. And here these foolish, worthless shepherds don't care about anybody or anything except for themselves. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to the shepherds of Israel who only take care of themselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? That's kind of a duh. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, you clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak or healed the sick or bound up the injured. You've not brought back the strays or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wander all over the mountains and on every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched for them or looked for them. Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because my flock lack a shepherd, and so has been plundered and has become food for all the wild animals, and because my shepherds did not search for my flock, but cared for themselves rather than for the flock, therefore, O shepherds, hear the word of the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against the shepherds and will hold them to account for my flock. I will remove them from tending the flock so that the shepherds no longer feed themselves. I will rescue my flock from their mouths, and it will no longer be food for them. Down to verse 17. As for you, my flock, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will judge between one sheep and another, and between rams and goats. Is it not enough for you to feed on the good pasture? Must you also trample the must you also trample the rest of your pasture with your feet? Is it not enough for you to drink clear water? Must you also muddy the rest with your feet? Must my flock feed on what you have trampled and drink what you have muddied with your feet? Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says to them. See, I myself will judge between the fat sheep and the lean sheep. Now, you've heard of fat cats, right? This is fat sheep. I will judge between the fat sheep and the lean sheep, because you shove with your shoulder and butting all the weak sheep with your horns until you have driven them away. I will save my flock, and they will no longer be plundered. I will judge between one sheep and another. Do you hear what's going on here? It's a metaphor, it's a parable, but God says, I have had such lousy, foolish, worthless shepherds, and all they do is take care of themselves. And what have they taught the sheep? They've taught the sheep to do the same thing. The leaders have been bullies, and so the sheep are bullying one another, and the fat sheep bully the weak sheep, and they butt them with their heads, and they trample through the water and make the water all muddy. And the same thing that the leaders have done, now the people are doing to one another. You have leaders who act like bullies, and the people act like bullies to one another. It's a pretty powerful passage, and we could spend some time reading it with great detail, but I want you to just get the big picture right now. In the middle of all of that, notice what God says. Look at verse 23. I will place over them one shepherd. Read good shepherd. Verse 23. I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David. Now, how long had David been dead when this was written? Several hundred years. This is obviously not talking about literal shepherd boy David, the son of Jesse. This is talking about the Messiah. And God says, you have been such lousy shepherds, and you have taught the sheep such lousy ways of relating to each other. I am going to get this straightened out. I'm going to bring along David, the Messiah, the real shepherd, and he'll show you what it's like to be a shepherd. I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will tend them, and he will tend them and be their shepherd. I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. And then the last verse, verse 31, you, my sheep, the people of my pasture, are people, and I am your God, declares the sovereign Lord. Now, if that is not the best buildup to John 10, I don't know what it is. So go back to John 10 now. Go back into your harmonies, John 10. And notice what has happened just before this. These foolish, worthless, bully shepherds have just grilled a man born blind who has been healed by Jesus. And they have gotten more and more angry at him. They have been muddying the waters with their big fat feet. They have been butting him with their big horns. They have been taking this weak little sheep who's just learning to stand on his own two legs. And these big bully rams are surrounding him and charging him with their horns and trying to knock him over. And the last thing that they do is they kick him out of the synagogue and they say, you're no longer welcome him. If they are not acting like the worthless, foolish shepherds of Ezekiel 34, I don't know what they're doing. And just notice how this story ends. Verse 30, go back up to chapter 9, verse 30. The man answered, now this is remarkable. Here is a little sheep that's finding its voice. Now this is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly man who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. To this I replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. Can't you just see them like big, bully, fat sheep charging this guy? And they threw him out. Jesus heard that they'd thrown him out. And when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus said, you have now seen him. In fact, he's the one speaking to you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. Jesus said, for judgment I have come into this world so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. Some Pharisees, again, think big fat sheep with muddy feet who have just finished trampling and charging this little lamb. These are the Pharisees. Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, what? Are we blind too? And it's almost like somebody has just gotten through beating up some poor little innocent person. And then they look up and say, what? Me? What did I do? It's a comic scene because they turn to Jesus and they say, oh, you mean there's something that we did that was wrong? And Jesus doesn't miss a beat. What? Are we blind too? Jesus said, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. Don't give me that. You are described perfectly in Ezekiel 34. You are the bully, big, fat rams. You are the lousy, worthless, foolish shepherds of Ezekiel 34 and Zechariah 10. Don't give me that. You know who you are. You know what you're all about. Don't claim to be innocent. If you were really blind, then there might be some excuse for you, but you know exactly what you're doing. You have bullied this man. I have done something marvelous in his life, and all you can do is beat him up. Don't give me that you're innocent. And Jesus gets pretty straight with him here. And then Jesus said, if you were really blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. And then he goes right on the next breath. No chapter break. Verse 1. I tell you the truth. The man who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in some other way, is a thief and a robber. Jesus gets stronger here. You are foolish, worthless shepherds. It gets worse. You're thieves. You're robbers. Now just think what's happened in the last 72 hours. If you hold your finger here and look back, what has happened in the last 72 hours? Go back to page 113. At the Feast of Tabernacles, what you have is everybody, top of page 113, everybody saying, okay, who's Jesus? What's he all about? And what happens as they are arguing, turn the page over to 114, verse 32. The Pharisees heard the crowd whispering such things about him. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees sent temple guards to do what? To arrest him. They are acting like big bully rams or lousy, foolish sheep. Here comes the good shepherd to get things straightened out. And what do? They want to arrest him. And it goes on down. You'll see here in verse 50, Nicodemus, who had gone to Jesus earlier, who was one of their number, asked, does our law condemn anyone without first hearing him to find out what he's doing? They replied, are you from Galilee? Look into it. You will find that a prophet does not come out of Galilee. What are they doing? They are tromping through clear waters. Nicodemus has a pretty clear picture of what's going on here, and they're muddying the waters. They're trying to make the waters all muddy for everybody else. They are killing and stealing. They are exploiting. They are acting just like those lousy, foolish, bully shepherds in Ezekiel 34. You go on to the next story, John 7:53 to 8:11, number 96 on page 115. What are they doing? They haul this woman in before Jesus and saying, she's been caught in adultery. We'd like to throw a lot of rocks at her until she dies. Jesus said, everybody who comes who's not a good shepherd, what do? They kill and steal. What are they doing? They're stealing this woman away and they're wanting to kill her. Jesus is calling them out on all that's been happening in the last 72 hours. You go down to the next story, 97. How does this story end? Look at the end of it there on page 117, verse 58. I tell you the truth, Jesus answered, before Abraham was, I am. At this, they picked up stones to stone him. They don't get to stone the woman, they're going to stone him. But Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. It wasn't time for Jesus to die yet, and he escapes. But what are they doing? These big, bullish shepherds are trying to first throw rocks at the woman. Jesus saves her like he said he would do. Now they're trying to throw rocks at Jesus, the good shepherd. He escapes. They are acting just like they were prophesied in Ezekiel 34 that they're going to act. And so we get to chapter 9, the story. This is all happening within about 72 hours. Chapter 9 here of the man born blind. And what do they do to him? They grill and roast him. They try to eat him for dinner. They throw him out of the synagogue. And Jesus calls him on it. And now he says, okay, it's time for us to just call this what it is. I am the good shepherd. You are the foolish, lousy shepherds. You are thieves and robbers. And so we read here, now back to John chapter 10, verse 2. The man who enters by the gate is the shepherd of his sheep. The watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but they did not understand what he was telling them. They're still standing there, scratching their heads and saying, okay, we don't get it. And Jesus says, okay, let's get a little bit clearer here. Verse 7, therefore, Jesus said again, I tell you the truth. I am the gate for the sheep. And some of us may say, wait a minute, gate? Jesus also said he's the door. You have to know the way that the sheep pens were constructed. They were constructed out of stones, usually, 3 or 4 feet high. stones made in an enclosure, but there was no door on it. It just had an opening. And at night, when they weren't out in the open fields, when they were coming into the enclosures, the shepherd slept in that opening and became literally the door, became literally the gate. And so for Jesus to say, I'm the gate, it's just an extension. I'm the shepherd, because the shepherd slept there and served as the human gate. And so no wild animal could get past him. The sheep couldn't get out. He was the gate. And Jesus is just deepening the picture of who he is, caring for his sheep. And he says, I am the gate, verse 7, I am the gate for the sheep. All who ever came before me were thieves and robbers. And I can imagine he's even pointing to these Pharisees. All that's gone on in the last 72 hours makes it really clear who they are in contrast to who he is. All who came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. He will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill. What have these guys been doing throughout their lives, but especially in the last 72 hours? They had been stealing and killing. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. You might be more familiar with the King James Version. I am come that they might have life and they may have it more abundantly. Gordon.
Jesus said that the way is narrow and the gate is narrow. You can almost think of the pen as God's framework for life.
Yeah, that's good.
Whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And all these other people just ignore it and climb over it.
Yeah, yeah.
He
Excellent.
wants the sheep to come in through that gate.
Excellent. I realize that I've been monologuing an awful lot and I have not asked you for your input. And Gordon, thank you. That's rich. John, please.
Yeah, we got to stop here just for a second, I think, and really begin to think about what, on reflection, how this impacts us and me. I mean, that gate is narrow. And I mean, we've had the incidences that have happened in our country in the last couple of weeks that help define this. We all go through a lot of work together, trying to get ourselves ready or prepared or in a place where maybe we can enter through the gate rather than go over the wall. When I picture somebody going over the wall, I picture somebody who's trying to take shortcuts. Somebody who is trying to get over or spin something. Almost, I want to get away with it. Rather than going through the gate, which is really hard. Because in preparation for going through the gate, look what Jesus went through. I mean, 40 days in the desert. You know, all what he had to endure. And so you reflect on us. What did I have to? We had a terrible incident happen in Texas. And I'm not passing judgment on this. Don't mean to, because I don't know. But there is debate that when that happened, no one charged in there to save those children. Rather, they waited 45 minutes. Those people went through years of training, and it measured to 1 minute. And they failed that 1 minute. Yet I can give other examples of a 22-year-old Marine not that long ago who was ordered to leave his place because they were ambushed, and he refused the order. And he kept going in, and he said, I am going to die. I don't know if you remember that. I am going to die. I know that. But I'm going to die this way. And in fact, he didn't die. And he received the Congressional Medal of Honor. He really didn't want the Congressional Medal of Honor. He wanted to drink a beer with the President of the United States. And the President honored that, actually did that. So my whole point with this is that we go through a lot of these things, Doug, in trying to think, where do I stand? And how am I prepared for my life? And for that 1 minute that's going to happen to me? And am I going to be there? Or am I going to try to climb over the wall? So it's a very, very personal message.
It is.
that,
It is.
I mean, that has application absolutely today. Very interesting, but that application is really important for us, I think.
It is. It is. And John, what I'd like to do is I'd like to jump from what you said. We're just down to our last couple minutes of class here. We have not touched on every detail in this passage. However, those details begin to make a lot more sense when you understand what the people were hearing. I promised you that we were going to say, who is Jesus and why does it matter? In this story, Jesus was saying, I am the good shepherd, and you know what a good shepherd is to be, and I'm being that. These guys are not good shepherds, they're foolish shepherds. They had been claiming to be the gatekeepers of your life, the gatekeepers of religion. They've lied to you. I am the real gate, and I'm the shepherd, and I'm telling you the truth. Who is Jesus? He's exactly who he says he is. And all those things that he has said he would do and be for us, he is. Whether we use the metaphor of sheep and shepherd or some other metaphor. So let me come back to this, and I'd like to hear from some of you who haven't spoken up yet. And that is, if, like I asked you a minute ago, we were to take a different metaphor, we said football coach, landscaper, teacher. If you were to take a metaphor that made sense to you, and you understand some of these things that Jesus was saying he was, who is Jesus to you and why does it matter? I want some of you to think for just a minute. I'd like you to give me, whether you use a metaphor or not, that's okay. But who is Jesus to you? We read something about who he was saying he was. Who is Jesus to you and why does it matter? I'd like to hear from 3 or 4 of you who have not spoken up yet. Please, Rod.
Oh, I'll break the ice. In another place in the Bible, Jesus has said, I want you to call me Abba, Father. Call the God, Abba, Father. And of course, that term Abba is a 3-year-old who's waiting for daddy to get home from work.
Yeah.
And whether that kid has stole a cookie and got a spanking earlier that morning, it doesn't matter. Daddy got home from work, and all he can do is, Daddy!
Yeah, oh, I love it.
And so Jesus is daddy to me. I never knew a father. I'm as close to dad as I ever got. And it happens to be my wife's dad. But so I try to put myself in those little booties and think of Jesus as daddy, and I don't have to be afraid of it.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. A couple others. Somebody else online or in the room. Who is Jesus to you and why does it matter? Clear in the back.
Yes, what I look at is I look at Christ as the King because the trust I have in him to take care of me now is complete enough that I don't have to worry. Or I see him as the King that's coming to take us home.
Amen. Thank you, Roy. One more. Yes, please, Sherry. By the way, Sherry, thank you for your text. And I don't know if you want me to read it or if you want to go ahead and comment on it now.
Comment. We understand Jesus as our shepherd because we raise sheep. We've been out in the night, in the cold.
Yeah. And Jesus is that for you. Amen. Let's close with the last words of this passage here. Verse 19. At these words, the Jews were again divided. Many of them said, he's demon possessed and raving mad. Why listen to him? Which incidentally, in the last 72 hours, they'd said this about Jesus about half a dozen times. It's just same old thing they're trotting out here. He's demon possessed and raving mad. Why listen to him? But others said, these are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Don't you love it that there are always typically some reasonable people who can speak reason when somebody's being really rash and unreasonable? These are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of a blind man? And so the more careful thinking people are saying, we know that Jesus is who he says he is on 2 counts. One is what he says, and it makes sense because it's built in Scripture. And the other is what he does. He's doing the stuff that he said he would do. And maybe that would be helpful for us. If we look at Jesus and we see what he says and what he does, we'll be more likely to say, Jesus, I'm willing to trust you instead of resist you. And at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. These bad shepherds were resisting Jesus. They were trying to get rid of him, arrest him, kill him. They were thieves and robbers, just trying to do away with him. And in the process, with all the people in their way. And instead, some people say, no, what he says, what he does makes sense. And I'd like to put my trust in him. I hope that that's where you'll find yourself today. Listening to what Jesus says, seeing what he does, and saying, I'm willing to put my trust in him. Ken?
Thank you. Wow. That was one of us.
Amen.
Read a lot, heard your whole life. I learned something every time I did. Every time I was thinking about a story I heard about my dad when I was a little boy. And before he died a couple of years ago, I finally asked him about it. He was kicked out of Sardis Church of God down in North Georgia in the 50s. And I had heard a lot of reasons. I've heard stories about why he was kicked out of the church, but I finally asked him. I said, I had heard that he had a lot of cousins and they looked a lot alike. One cousin was an alcoholic, and I said, I heard that someone confused you with Sidney DeFoor because Sidney was drunk. They thought it was you and they kicked you out of the church. I said, no, that's not the reason they kicked me out of the church. They kicked me out of the church because I gave some money to Cranier Church of God. They were there have been some bad shepherds for a long time. A long time. Of course, he was happy to go when they made such a big one to the Cranier Church. So thank you, Doug. I mean, I don't need to add anything else. There's good shepherds, there's bad shepherds. And I'll tell you, in the next 5 minutes, you're going to hear a good shepherd if you're going to the service. Jerry Arnold is an amazing shepherd. I was with a friend of mine who's very conservative, and he really ripped me apart this week for coming to this church. We're still friends, but he just couldn't get it. And I said, well, have you met Jerry Arnold? No. He's a good shepherd. So with that said, John, will you have our prayer?
Father, thank you again for bringing us all together and for your message that you gave us through Doug. Thanks for the blessing that you've given us to provide him to speak your words. Help us understand what it takes to be the good shepherd. Help us understand how to apply that to what we need to fulfill our reason from you and through you. Thank you for this gorgeous day.
I'll be leading our discussion next week. It's about the 72. If you want to get on our email.